Hello, welcome to the last lecture of this module. DNA, the secrets it tells about evolution. Well, in this module and the last module, we've looked at a lot of supporting evidence for the theory of evolution. And some things like the fossil record has a lot of evidence that shows us that life has changed throughout the ages. And you can even find evidence of that in living organisms too. And as you filled out your activity sheet, if you started that on sort of putting together in a review chart some of the evidence that we've talked about for evolution, you might have noticed things like homologous structures, bones which you have not actually seen in person yet, but when you do see them in person and their amazing similarities, you might agree that, wow, these amazing similarities suggest that these different animals with bones have a common ancestor, or the same thing with the embryos. But why do biologists believe that all life on the planet arose from a common ancestor, not just all trees had a common ancestors, all animals, all fungus? And our discussion about DNA will help answer that question. All right, so what can we learn from DNA? So actually, DNA helps our study of evolution in several different ways. As we'll see by the end of this presentation, it can show us how closely organisms related. It also gives us clues to the deep history of life, and we don't really have time to explore all of this, but it's just really, you would not believe that if you really sort of can study DNA and understand its secrets, it tells us some amazing things about the deep history of life. Sort of like the fossil record, if you really know how to interpret it, it tells us some amazing things. And it also tells us how many bases there are to this tree of life. And that's what this is the approach we're going to look at the beginning of this presentation. So, if you took Biology 151 or another biology course in high school, you should have discussed how do genes code for genetic traits. And this is why I gave you these DNA review assignments. And if you had a basic biology course recently, they should have been very, very easy for you. If you haven't had biology for a while, they would have been a little bit more difficult, and I apologize. And I hope you got help from your classmates or from myself, but they were really essential in understanding what we have to talk about now about evolution. So how do genes code for genetic traits? The answer is pretty simple. Every gene codes for one protein. So let's run through a few examples of that. What are some things that genes code for? What are some traits that you inherited from your parents? Maybe an example that pops to mind is eye color. Yes, genes code for eye color. So you inherited a piece of DNA from your parent and it coded for a certain protein. So for instance, and this protein is deposited in your iris. And if that protein reflected the wavelengths of light that we interpret as green, then people looking at your eyes say, oh, you have green eyes. Let's think of another example, hair color. Well, you have genes that code for hair, which is a protein. And so the segment of DNA codes for the protein that makes up your hair. Let's take maybe a more serious example. Probably all of you listening to this presentation have normal blood clotting. If you have normal blood clotting, then you have a gene that codes for a protein factor, and this protein factor causes your blood to clot, and that's why you don't bleed to death when you get a cut. Unfortunately, some people have a mutated gene that codes for a messed up protein, and they have hemophilia or bleeder's disease. And before the 20th century, children who were hemophiliac usually died before they reached adulthood. So again, these are examples of how a piece of DNA determines our genetic traits, because any genetic trait we have is basically the result of a protein, or it is a protein. And it's pretty amazing that this gene determines that, because remember, a gene is a segment of DNA, which is a series of letters, which we represent, a series of nucleotides, which we represent as letters. So you remember there's 4 DNA bases: cytosine, guanine, adenine, and thymine. And so to the untrained eye, there's just this DNA molecule. And then scientists, we assign each base a letter, C, A, T, or G. And there's 2 strands of the DNA molecule, but one that basically contains the genetic code, and one is the placeholder. So I'm just looking at the coding strand. So we know how the code works, and hopefully you do because you've run those lessons. We know that every 3 bases codes for 1 amino acid. So remember, a gene is a sequence of DNA building blocks. It's a sequence of nucleotides, which represent the 4 different types with the letters. And we know that every 3 of these bases codes for 1 particular amino acid. And there's 20 different amino acids found in nature. So here we go again. This is just a picture illustrating what we just said. Here's the DNA ladder, if you will, the double helix. One strand is the coding strand, one is the placeholder strand or the template strand. So here's the coding strand. Let's look at, this is called a codon, ATG. And each codon, every 3 bases codes for 1 amino acid. CTA is a different codon, codes for a different amino acid. GGC codes for yet another amino acid. But the question is, are these DNA words universal? So we're just going to do a little thought experiment here. I want you to read this word and think of what it means. Well, if you are an English-speaking person, this word you probably pronounce chat, and it means to talk. And usually when you're chatting, you're talking lightly, not a really serious conversation, nothing heavy, deep, and real, just sort of light chit-chat. Yeah, you get the idea. All right, so these are 4 letters. I mean, these are 4 symbols. This is a code right here. These 4 letters, which are commonly used alphabet letters, we decode that. We decode that to mean talk, light chit-chat. Now, I don't know, is anybody listening to this? Do you know any other languages? Qui parle français? Quelqu'un? Je ne sais pas. I don't know who's listening to this. All right. If you are a French-speaking person, especially a native speaker, you would decode these same 4 letters in a totally different way. If you are a French-speaking person, you would interpret this word as chat, which means cat. So, same 4 letters, decoded totally different ways. All right, if you're an English-speaking person, you read these 4 letters and you think, oh, talk. But if you are a French-speaking person, you think of a furry mammal, all right, that when you pet it the wrong way, it goes, meow, all right? Yeah, that's my ugly drawing of a cat. All right, so this is the coding. English-speaking people decode this word totally different. The same exact coding, decoded in totally different ways. So let's continue our little story here. If we just take out the H, we have a DNA codon. All right, now, what if all animals, when you plugged this codon into their cells, if you plugged in the codon CAT, they decoded it to be the amino acid arginine. And let's say a plant decoded it to be the amino acid lysine. Yes, I'm not a very good drawer. And let's say a fungus decoded it, and it was, what did I say? How about glycine? Okay. So if all animals decoded this DNA code to mean 1 amino acid, all plants decoded it to be another amino acid like glycine, all fungi decoded it to be glycine, and all bacteria decoded another way. Well, that would argue for several tree of lives. You'd say all animals have a common ancestor, all plants have a common ancestor, whatever I said before, all fungi had a common ancestor. In fact, if that were true, that would pretty much disprove common ancestry. I mean, you get your DNA decoding system from your parents and they from their parents, and basically this is what we inherited from our ancestry. And if the DNA was decoded totally different by humans and boa constrictors and monkeys and palm trees and mold and mildew, I would not be teaching common ancestry. I don't see how that could be explained by natural science. But that is not what we find at all. We find that this genetic code is universal, and that we don't call this the human genetic code. We call it the universal genetic code, because what example did I give you? CAT, all right? And all plants and all animals and all fungi and all bacteria, CAT is decoded by the organism and translated into the amino acid histidine. All living things. Very powerful evidence for a universal common ancestor. Oh, they went the wrong way. All right, so to review, who can review the human genetic code? Well, all organisms. It's not just the human genetic code. The genetic code is universal. Now, this is not just a philosophical statement. This has actually very profound implications. For instance, genetic engineering. Now, there's a good chance that people listening to this recording know somebody who's diabetic. And you know if somebody's diabetic, if they have type 1 diabetes, they are missing a very important protein, insulin. So insulin is a very important protein hormone. It's essential for life. It allows you to transport sugar from your blood into your cells, because sugar does not do you any good in your blood. In fact, it's harmful. If you have extra high blood sugar levels over a long period of time. Sugar has to be transported into cells where it can be broken down and the energy released. So diabetes is a very serious problem. And people with type 1 diabetics, if you care, it's an autoimmune disease, and they cannot make insulin. So this is a life-threatening condition. So what they used to do, does anybody know what they used to do to get insulin for diabetics? Like, I don't know, let's see, 40 years ago or so? They used to go to slaughterhouses and get pig pancreases and grind up pig pancreases. And it would take about a ton of pig pancreases to be able to extract enough insulin to supply a diabetic for a week, because hormones are just produced in very minute amounts. And that worked okay, but this is a problem. Remember, insulin is a protein, and so it's made up of basically can be thought of as a chain of amino acids. Well, pig insulin and human insulin differ by, I think it's 3 amino acids. Don't quote me on that. You can look it up. But anyway, the moral of the story is some people were allergic to pig insulin. And so then they were left with this horrible conundrum. They could take pig insulin and have an allergic reaction and be miserable every day of their life, or they could not take pig insulin and they would die. So again, not a very lovely choice. But today we have genetic engineering. Now, we haven't talked that much about bacteria yet. We've mentioned that they're prokaryotic cells, and their DNA, instead of being found in the nucleus in the form of many chromosomes, have one big loop of DNA in the middle. So this is supposed to be a bacteria cell, and here's this one big loop of DNA. And now through genetic engineering, we can take a human cell, and obviously this is a lot harder than it sounds, and extract the gene for insulin. So you take the human gene for insulin, and you can actually cut the bacterial DNA and splice the human gene for insulin into the bacterial DNA. So this one big loop represents the bacterial DNA with the human gene for insulin spliced into it. Well, we have not had a common ancestor with bacteria. We have not shared a common ancestor with bacteria for 3 billion years, at least. Yet, what happens when we put the human gene for insulin into a bacteria cell? It can read this human genetic code, and it can decode it. And guess what it makes? That's absolutely right. It makes human insulin. And so we have basically taken test tubes of bacteria and turned them into chemical factories. We sort of this is like original bioengineering. We turn bacteria into little factories to make the human test tube, or sorry, the human hormone insulin. So again, if you have a test tube, you know that's just full of these little bacteria cells, and they all are cranking out insulin. You can make large quantities of insulin, human insulin, which we can then purify and give to diabetics. And humans are not allergic to human insulin. So again, the universal code of life is not just a philosophical thing like, oh, evolution happened millions of years ago, but we really don't care about it today. Yes, modern medical practice depends a lot on evolutionary theory and natural selection. I could probably say more about that, but I won't right now. So again, the moral of this story is the practical implications. Bacteria are programmed with the human insulin gene to produce human insulin. And researchers love the universal genetic code too. For instance, here we have goldfish that are glowing like jellyfish. Yes, goldfish usually do not glow green like this, but jellyfish, which we will talk about in Unit 3, they do make a protein that is aptly named green fluorescent protein because it fluoresces. And so this is called a transgenic experiment where you take a gene from one organism, like a jellyfish, and splice it into a developing fish zygote, for instance, embryo. All right. Another example is here's again bacteria. They are glowing green because scientists have spliced in the green fluorescent protein. And oh, I forgot to mention, fluorescence occurs when these are viewed under UV light. So we have fish in the dark with a black light on it, and they fluoresce. And a lot of genetic experiments also use the green fluorescent protein because you can tell if the DNA you have been trying to work with has been spliced into the bacteria. So here we, to summarize, gave evidence of the universal genetic code. That's very strong evidence for a common ancestor and practical implications for today. And then finally here, DNA tells us how closely related two different organisms are. So for instance, humans and chimpanzees share about 99% of their DNA. So if you had all the DNA of humans and held it side by side up to a chimpanzee, you would see that 99% of our DNA is shared. And so this is one way that we've sort of constructed what's called these phylogenetic trees or trees of life. We look at the DNA, we see how many mutations there are as a tool to figure out how closely organisms are related to evolution. So this is your last little piece of the puzzle for filling in your review chart, and I'll see you in the next module.